the plantation lady, who bred slaves with her own sons, George's secret 1847. They were found beneath the earth, behind iron that screamed when it was torn open, hidden under a plantation that history pretended had never breathed. Union soldiers stepping into the basement of the Thornhill estate expected rot, vermin, maybe forgotten supplies. What they found instead was silencewitches, children pressed together in the dark, their skin pale from years without sun, their breaths shallow, as if even breathing required permission. They all looked the same. High cheekbones, sharp as cut glass, pale green eyes that reflected the lantern light like trapped animals, auburn hair threaded with gold, as if the same hand had shaped them again and again, correcting flaws, refining a design. Some were barely old enough to speak. Others were nearing adulthood, their faces already marked by understanding too heavy for their years. When the soldiers tried to coax them forward, none moved. They only stared. Finally, a girl stepped out, thin, rigid, 13 years old, and already exhausted by obedience. Her voice did not tremble. She told them what Mistress had taught them to say, that they were not prisoners, that they were a legacy, that they could never leave because they were her blood. Hardened men who had marched through battlefields turned away to retch in the dirt. What was written down afterward was minimal, sealed, buried. A single confidential letter, locked away in regimental files. Local histories erased the estate completely, as if Thornhill had sunk into the red clay and taken its sins with it. But it existed, and so did Katherine Thornhill, and the system she built in the quiet years before the war found her door. Before this story drags you deeper, understand this. The unease crawling across your skin is deserved. This is the kind of history that whispers instead of screams. Gospel of the haunted exists to follow those whispers into places others refuse to look. Stories sealed in courthouse basements, folded into forgotten military records, left to fester. If you feel watched while listening, if the shadows around you feel closer, then you already understand why these stories demand to be told. And now, we return to the beginning. To winter, to grief sharpened into purpose, to a widow who chose to survive by any means necessary. The morning Katherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was colder than any Burke County had endured in decades. Frost clung to the cotton fields like a warning. Thornhill Estate sprawled across acres of exhausted land southwest of the county seat. Soil worked until it could barely give any more. Cotton had once made men rich here, but by then it only swallowed effort and returned disappointment. Prices were falling. Debts were rising. Labor was disappearing into distant wars. Plantations that had thrived a generation earlier were now quietly bleeding to death. Jonathan Thornhill had inherited the estate with promise and squandered it with enthusiasm. He gambled as if luck were a loyal friend. By the time fever took him, creditors were already circling. Fields barely fed those who worked them. Tools were worn thin. Pieces of the house itself had been sold away, elegance traded for time. Katherine was left with a dying plantation, suffocating debt, and a house full of ghosts that did not intend to leave quietly. She was young, educated, raised to command servants and host dinners, not to beg merchants for mercy. Her father's name still carried weight in Augusta, but pride does not pay mortgages. Worse still was the boy who watched her from the edges of every room. Richard Thornhill, her stepson, 16 and already hardened against her. He carried his dead mother like a blade, using it to keep Katherine at a distance. He hid among books, avoided the fields, spoke with dangerous softness about the enslaved people who remained. Once, he suggested they should learn to read. Katherine shut that idea down with a look that promised consequences. Sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. The house mirrored the estate's decay, whitewashed brick peeling under damp air, columns cracked with age. Rain found its way through the roof and into the walls, soaking the bones of the place. Furniture whispered of better years, surrounded by cheaper replacements bought when the good pieces had been sold to cover Jonathan's losses. Outbuildings sagged. Quarters stood quiet, the people within them waiting for the next sale, the next tearing away of family. Fear lay over the property like low fog, thick and inescapable. Katherine moved through it all with controlled fury. Grief did not soften her. It sharpened her. She saw what others refused to say aloud. This plantation would not survive by old rules. Selling more bodies would only delay collapse. Outside labor was too expensive. Escape was always a risk. What she needed was control that could not be broken. Loyalty written into blood. Dependence that could not run. And so, in the cold quiet of that winter, as the ground hardened and the fields slept, Katherine Thornhill began to plan something unspeakable. She would create property that could never truly belong to itself, flesh-bound not just by chains or law, but by lineage. Children who would look into her face and see their own features staring back. Generations folded inward, ownership disguised as family, captivity justified as inheritance. The house would keep its secrets. The land would absorb its screams. And history, she believed, would look away. For years it worked. The world beyond Thornhill paid no attention. Cotton still moved. Accounts were balanced. The children were hidden, and Katherine told herself this was necessity, not evil. Survival, not madness. Until the war came. Until iron doors were forced open. Until lantern light revealed what had been grown in the dark. And even now, long after the estate vanished from maps and memory, there are those who say the land remembers, that beneath the red clay something still waits, watching, breathing, knowing that blood, once claimed, is never truly released. She sat across from the estate's lawyer as rain tapped softly against the tall windows, each drop sounding like a quiet accusation. Ambrose Talbot did not soften his words for grief or propriety. He spoke plainly, as men do when numbers matter more than feelings. The debts were crushing, the accounts blood-red ink. There were only two paths left. One was surrender. Sell the land, sell the remaining enslaved workers, satisfy the creditors, and retreat to Augusta to live quietly under her father's roof. A widow reduced to dependency, her failure whispered behind gloved hands. The other path was survival through revival, somehow restoring profit to a plantation already half dead. Talbot considered that second option little more than a fantasy, given the exhausted soil, the collapsing cotton market, and the estate's dwindling labor force. Neither future was tolerable to Katherine Thornhill. Returning to her father's house would mean erasing herself, becoming a cautionary tale dressed in black silk. Yet she also knew the old methods would not save Thornhill. The land had been stripped of generosity. The tools were relics. The people left on the property were too few to make cotton profitable, and there was no money to acquire more. The plantation was a body with failing organs, and Katherine refused to watch it die. Night after night she sat alone at her desk, candlelight flickering over ledgers and account books, shadows stretching across the walls like reaching hands. Sleep abandoned her. In that hollow space between exhaustion and resolve, the idea came. It arrived without drama, without horror, wrapped instead in cold arithmetic. If labor could not be purchased, it would be produced. Not carelessly, not by chance, but by design. A system refined and controlled, stripped of sentiment. Most plantations encouraged births with small rewards and waited years for children to grow into usefulness. Katherine dismissed that as inefficiency. Her vision was sharper, darker, more precise. She would create workers bound to Thornhill not merely by law, but by blood. Children who could never be sold because they carried her lineage. Lives shaped to believe loyalty was inheritance. Bondage disguised as family. The thought did not repulse her. It felt CLN, UGL, and she was still young. Her body capable. She would choose the strongest men among the enslaved population, those with steady tempers and resilient frames. From them, she would conceive children. Those children would be raised knowing exactly who they were and where they belonged. They would receive small privileges, subtle distinctions that would tie gratitude to obedience. When they matured, they would be paired to produce the next generation. In time, Thornhill would team with workers who could never leave, because leaving would mean abandoning their own blood. In her calculations, the numbers worked beautifully. Within a few decades, the estate would possess a self-sustaining labor force, immune to sale, escape, or rebellion. Katherine began to document her design, but not as confession. This was not a diary of emotions. Feelings were irrelevant. She created records. Cultivation records, she called them. Pages filled with observations, measurements, and projections. To protect herself, she wrote in code, substituting harmless agricultural terms for unspeakable acts. Children were seedlings, men were rootstock. Conception became planting. Birth was harvest. The pages bore diagrams resembling livestock charts, branches and lines mapping inheritance like crop rotation. It was meticulous. It was monstrous. And to Katherine, it was ART. Her first choice was Isaac. He had been born on the estate, knew no other world. He was strong, dependable, and unremarkable enough to obey without curiosity. On a mild evening in early spring, after the quarters had gone quiet, she summoned him to the main house. No witnesses. No ceremony. What occurred was reduced in her journal to a single, emotionless entry. First planting completed. Conditions favorable. She called him back again, and again, until she was satisfied. Weeks later, she noted her certainty of pregnancy with the same tone she used to record seed viability. Cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in winter. The house absorbed these changes in silence. But not everyone was blind. Richard Thornhill began to sense something wrong as the months edged forward. Katherine stopped riding the property at dawn, claiming heat that had not yet arrived. Meals were taken alone. The servant assigned to her was dismissed without explanation. For a woman obsessed with appearance, this withdrawal was strange. UNURAL. The truth revealed itself in fragments. One afternoon, hidden among the tall shelves of the library, Richard overheard voices drifting from the adjoining parlor. Katherine was speaking with Miriam Grayson, the local midwife. Miriam was known throughout the county for her skill and her discretion, attending births for anyone who could pay or command her silence. Richard listened as Miriam confirmed what Katherine already knew. The delivery would come near winter. Arrangements would need to be made. Privacy assured. Then came the question that froze him in place. Katherine mentioned her husband's passing. Miriam paused, careful, professional. The timing was close. Katherine's reply was calm, rehearsed. She spoke of intimacy in January, before illness consumed Jonathan. The words sounded reasonable. They were LIES. Richard knew it. He had watched his father deteriorate, fevered and barely conscious, unable to lift his head, much less touch his wife. The mathematics screamed impossibility. When the women left, Richard emerged shaking, the room spinning around him. He understood now that something had been set in motion that could not be undone. His stepmother was not merely hiding a pregnancy, she was hiding a PRPOC. And whatever she was cultivating beneath the roof of Thornhill Estate was not meant to see daylight. Outside, the land waited. The soil held its breath, and somewhere beneath the quiet, the future of Thornhill was already taking shape, growing in darkness, fed by secrets, destined to stain the ground so deeply that even when the house fell and the name vanished, the earth itself would remember. By the time autumn crept across the estate, Richard's body began to betray him. It started subtly, a strange weakness in his limbs, a heaviness that clung to his muscles as if the air itself had thickened. Soon came the stomach pains, sharp enough to steal his breath, dull enough to linger for hours. Katherine responded with a performance of care, so convincing it almost felt crueler than indifference. She insisted he remain in bed. She brought him broths and tonics. Her voice softened, her hand cool against his forehead, her concern perfectly measured. TOPRFECCT. Richard lay there staring at the ceiling, realizing his illness served her purposes far too well. His thoughts circled the same unbearable truth. There had been no possibility, none at all, that his father had touched Katherine in the time she claimed. Which meant the child growing inside her had been conceived after Jonathan was already cold in the ground. The implications churned his stomach more violently than any sickness. If the truth escaped the walls of Thornhill, scandal would devour what little remained of the family name. Creditors would descend without mercy. Katherine's own family would cast her out, but beyond ruin and disgrace was something darker. Katherine intended to build her future on a lie so absolute it would rewrite reality itself. She would present this child as Jonathan's heir, rewriting bloodlines with a straight face. Richard weighed his options in silence. Confrontation was impossible. He was young, powerless, legally invisible beneath her authority. Appealing to the lawyer would collapse without proof. Writing for help would never leave the estate unseen. So he watched. From hallways, from behind doors, from shadows that learned to keep his secrets. And what he saw confirmed his worst fears. Isaac was summoned often, always after nightfall, always when oversight was conveniently absent. Richard noticed the difference in Katherine's voice when she addressed him. Not gentle, but deliberate. Not commands, but sentences. A calculated respect. By the heat of summer, certainty hardened into horror. Isaac was the father. The realization struck like ice down Richard's spine. This was no reckless affair. This was intention. Katherine had chosen this path with open eyes, crossing every boundary not out of passion, but strategy. What kind of mind reduced people to tools so completely? Part of the answer revealed itself when Katherine traveled briefly into town, leaving the house quiet and unguarded. Richard searched for documents, anything that might expose her. Instead, he found the journal, hidden, locked, waiting. The barrier yielded easily to determination. Inside, the pages spoke in disguise, innocent words masking abominations. Richard's mind, always sharp with patterns, unraveled the code in secret moments stolen from fear. What emerged from those pages made his blood turn to ice. This was no single deception. It was a system, a design. Katherine had mapped out a future where flesh was cultivated like crops, where children were planned and paired, where lineage was engineered to serve her needs. She evaluated bodies, temperaments, resilience. She speculated about inherited traits as if discussing soil quality. The language was cold, clinical, inhuman. The people described were stripped of names and reduced to functions. It was a manual for creating generations of bondage, disguised as family. Radium GT Felty Leaky Beam ATCHD. Richard copied what he could, his hands trembling, the scratch of pen on paper sounding thunderous in his ears. This was proof. This was damnation written in ink. He could expose her. He could stop it. Or so he believed, until that evening. At dinner, Katherine studied him with eyes that seemed to see beneath skin. Casually, she asked about her study, about papers disturbed. Richard lied, the word tasting like ash. Katherine continued cutting her food with precise, unhurried motions. She spoke of privacy, of trust, of consequences. Her voice never rose, but the threat coiled through every syllable. Famenile loyalty, she said, was everything. Without it, civilization collapsed into savagery. She smiled then, a curve of lips devoid of warmth, and spoke of Jonathan, of how fragile memory could be, of how easily scandal might tarnish it, especially if it came from within the household. Richard understood. If he spoke, she would destroy him first. She would paint him as unstable, bitter, cruel enough to invent horrors about a grieving widow, and the world would believe her. That night, he burned the pages he had copied, watching the words curl and vanish into smoke. But he did not stop watching her, and his body continued to fail. Fatigue settled into his bones. Concentration slipped away like water through fingers. Food lost its taste. Headaches bloomed behind his eyes, pressing, pulsing, relentless. Katherine noticed everything. She adjusted his diet, his medicine, his isolation. The more he weakened, the stronger she seemed. Her pregnancy progressed. Her confidence grew. It was as if his decline fed her ascent. Richard began to wonder if his sickness was coincidence at all, or if it was simply another variable in Katherine's calculations. Another obstacle quietly removed. He lay awake at night listening to the house breathe around him, the walls thick with secrets, the floorboards whispering beneath unseen footsteps. Somewhere in the estate, plans continued to unfold, indifferent to his suffering. Outside, the land remained still. The soil held what it had been given. And within that silence, something vast and terrible was being prepared, not with chains or whips alone, but with ink, patience, and a smile that promised care while delivering ruin. The future was no longer coming. It was already here, growing unseen, waiting for its moment to rise from the dark and claim everything it had been promised. She took complete control of his care, and in doing so, sealed his fate. Every meal arrived by her own hands, bowls of thin broth that steamed faintly, bread softened until it barely held shape, food chosen not to nourish but to weaken. She watched him eat with a patience that felt ceremonial. When his strength failed further, she sent for Miriam Grayson. The midwife came quietly, her presence already woven into the darkest threads of the estate. She examined Richard with solemn efficiency and delivered a verdict designed to comfort and condemn at once. Nervous collapse, she said. Perhaps the wasting sickness. Rest was essential. Air, when possible, a tonic to strengthen the blood. Katherine obtained the tonic herself from Augusta, presenting it as medicine while measuring each dose with unnerving precision. She spoke softly as she adjusted his pillows, her voice rich with practiced sympathy. She told him of family members lost young, of fragile constitutions, of fate. Her words floated like feathers, meant to smother resistance. Richard listened, eyes half-lidded, and understood with terrifying clarity what was being done to him. He had read enough. He knew the signs, the creeping weakness, the burning stomach, the trembling limbs. This was not illness. It was execution stretched across days, hidden behind concern and whispered prayers. She was removing him with the same calculated care she applied to everything else. The last witness, the last threat, murder disguised as mercy. He tried to resist, but isolation wrapped around him tighter each day. Servants obeyed her without hesitation. The overseer stayed away. The stairs became mountains. The distance to the road might as well have been an ocean. By the time the leaves fell and the air sharpened, Richard could barely sit upright. In a final act of defiance, he gathered what little strength remained and began to write. The letter took days. Each line wrestled from exhaustion. He described everything. The journal, the plan, the poison. His words trembled, but the truth remained. When he sealed it, hope flickered weakly. He entrusted it to a young servant, begging her to deliver it unseen. Fear betrayed him. She carried the letter straight to Katherine, shaking with terror. Katherine read it in silence. Then she came to his room, the fire already lit. She fed the pages to the flames one by one while he watched, too weak to rise, too weak to scream. Ash drifted upward like black snow. Her voice was gentle, almost loving. She told him he was very sick. That fever could twist the mind. That imagining such horrors was understandable. She called it a kindness that his suffering would not last much longer. Her smile was calm. Finiel. He died quietly, his body reduced to little more than shadow and bone. A doctor was summoned to make it official, to write the lie that would seal the truth beneath ink. He noted the wasting. He shook his head at the speed of it. The estate mourned in formal gestures. Katherine wore grief like a costume, perfect and convincing. And soon after the ground closed over Richard Thornhill, she gave birth to a son. Healthy, strong, named for the dead. She explained the timing away with practiced ease. Few questioned it. Those who did said nothing. Silence was safer. What followed appeared, to outsiders, like rebirth. Thornhill estate recovered. Fields yielded again. Labor increased. Katherine's reputation shifted from pitied widow to formidable manager. She was spoken of with respect, even admiration. But beneath the surface, the machinery she had designed continued to turn. She bore more children in the years that followed, each arrival planned, recorded, attended only by Miriam Grayson. The midwife's role expanded beyond delivery. She became an instrument, a gatekeeper, paid handsomely, housed comfortably, bound by complicity. Her work extended into shadows where no records existed. When pregnancies emerged that did not align with Katherine's designs, they were erased. Quietly, efficiently, in a room hidden behind another building, far from the house, far from witnesses. The women endured these violations in silence. Trauma was swallowed because there was no language allowed for it. Loss was endured because grief had no value here. But whispers traveled anyway. Stories passed in low voices at night. Women who were heavy with child and suddenly were not. Blood explained away. Explanations forced upon them. Everyone knew the truth, and no one dared say it aloud. One woman did. Ruth. She carried life that had not been approved. She loved the father, a bond formed in defiance of design. When Katherine discovered this, her response was immediate and merciless. The order was given. Ruth fled into the trees, driven by desperation stronger than fear. She ran until her lungs burned and the forest swallowed her. It did not save her. Dogs found her. Hands dragged her back. The procedure was carried out while she was held down. Her screams absorbed by the land. Ruth lived. But something inside her did not. Whatever remained afterward moved like a ghost through the quarters. Eyes empty, spirit shattered. Her survival became a warning. And so the system endured, clean on the surface, rot beneath. Children grew who bore familiar features. Eyes echoed eyes. Hair mirrored hair. Blood folded inward on itself. Katherine watched it all with satisfaction, convinced she had built something permanent. Something unbreakable. But the land remembered everything. Every scream. Every secret. Every life reduced to calculation. And long after the house would fall silent, and the name Thornhill would fade from maps, the soil would continue to hold what was planted there, waiting, breathing, knowing that some legacies do not rest quietly in the grave. They linger, and when the time is right, they rise, in that sealed world of red clay roads and distant pine forests, where the law rarely crossed the threshold of a powerful estate. Katherine Thornhill faced no resistance. Authority rested entirely in her hands, unquestioned and absolute. There were no inspectors, no neighbors close enough to notice patterns, no voices with the power to challenge her will. What she built unfolded in isolation, protected by distance and fear. Those who suffered beneath it learned quickly that survival depended on silence. After the night Ruth was dragged back from the woods, something inside her dimmed. She moved through the quarters like a hollowed figure, eyes fixed on nothing, hands performing tasks without thought. She spoke little. She resisted no more. Illness found her easily after that, as if despair had opened a door. When fever swept through the quarters, Ruth did not fight it. She was gone within days, her body lowered into the ground without ceremony. She was young, too young, and her death became another unspoken warning, etched into the memories of those who remained. But Ruth was only one name among many swallowed by Thornhill's silence. By the middle of that decade, Katherine's design had matured into something unmistakable. She had borne several children, each carefully planned, each fitting neatly into her vision. On paper, they did not exist as hers at all. She recorded them as property, registering them as children born to enslaved women, securing legal ownership over her own blood. It was a maneuver as brilliant as it was vile. In reality, these children lived apart from the quarters, housed within the main residence, dressed in finer garments, fed better food, taught letters and numbers in rooms closed to outsiders. They occupied a space that did not truly exist. Not family, not free, not fully enslaved in the way others were. They were something new, something wrong. The eldest, Jonathan, carried Katherine's face so clearly that strangers remarked upon it without realizing the danger of what they observed. His eyes mirrored hers. His hair caught the same light. He moved with a quiet gravity unusual for a child. He had no memory of the man who fathered him, a man long sold away once his usefulness had ended. Katherine had deemed that presence inconvenient. The sale had been profitable. Practical decisions always came easily to her. The younger children were told a story polished smooth by repetition. They were orphans, fortunate ones, rescued by Christian charity. Katherine played the role of savior flawlessly, instructing them personally, shaping their minds, while assuring herself that no one would ever question her methods. Teaching them to read was forbidden by law, but laws only mattered when enforced. Within Thornhill's walls, Katherine wrote her own. She was not raising children in the way most understood the word. She was cultivating assets. She measured them, observed them, noted their strengths, their obedience, their resistance. She watched for signs of intelligence, of physical promise, of pliability. Her journal grew thicker with each passing season, its pages heavy with intention. The future she envisioned required patience. The children needed time. Bodies had to mature. Bloodlines had to be guided carefully. She was willing to wait. And while she waited, she continued. More children came, each conceived with deliberation, each father selected as one might select breeding stock. Health mattered, strength mattered, clear eyes, straight limbs, anything else was irrelevant. Personality meant nothing. Love did not factor into her calculations. The men had no choice. When summoned, they came. They understood the cost of refusal. Pain, sale, separation. Worse, some of them knew what it meant when Katherine called for them after dark. They knew the children she bore would carry their blood, while never knowing their names. They endured a torment that cut deeper than any whip. To see one's own child pass by without acknowledgement. To hear them speak Katherine's name with affection. to protect them from nothing. One man did try to resist. He was young, newly married, his wife expecting their first child. When he refused the summons, the response was swift and public. He was beaten before the assembled workers, his cries echoing across the yard, his body reduced to an example. Afterward, he was taken to the house anyway. Compliance was inevitable. Silence followed. His wife never asked. He never told. Some truths could not survive being spoken aloud. By then, Thornhill appeared ordinary to an outsider's eye. Fields worked. Meals cooked. Orders followed. But beneath that surface lay a hierarchy shaped by Katherine's private logic. Field workers labored under watchful cruelty. House servants moved carefully through polished rooms. And then there were the special children, growing quietly under Katherine's gaze. 10 of them by that point, ranging from infants to those nearing adolescence. They were watched more closely than anyone else. Measured, compared, prepared, the others saw it. They did not have words for theories or systems, but they recognized patterns. They noticed the journal always kept locked away, the measuring tapes, the way Katherine's eyes lingered. They whispered at night about what would happen when those children became adults. No one doubted the answer. Katherine had made her intentions clear enough through hints, through instructions, through the cold certainty in her voice. These children were meant to produce more children. Generations born already claimed. It was horror disguised as progress. An abomination cloaked in efficiency. Katherine believed she was building something permanent, something no law or war could dismantle. A workforce bound not by chains alone, but by blood and manipulation. A living system designed to endure long after she was gone. And yet, the land absorbed everything. The cries, the secrets, the suffering. The soil remembered names even when records did not. Beneath Thornhill Estate, beneath the carefully ordered rows and polished floors, the truth pressed upward, patient and heavy, because what was planted there was never meant to stay buried forever. Some legacies do not fade. They wait, and when the time comes, they surface, demanding to be seen, to be named, to be reckoned with. The only figure who might have noticed the pattern was the man entrusted with keeping Thornhill's paperwork clean. The lawyer in Wesboro handled deeds, debts, and filings, and his hands passed over documents that, if studied too closely, might have revealed unsettling questions. But he was a man who preferred smooth accounts to moral puzzles. Profit softened curiosity. As Thornhill's ledgers began to recover, as payments arrived on time and balances shrank, his attention drifted elsewhere. A successful client required no interrogation. Silence, in this case, was mutually beneficial. Distance did the rest. The plantation lay far from town, connected by a road that turned to mud and ruts when the weather soared. Winter could cut it off completely. Neighbors were scarce, their own concerns fenced in by acres and fear. Katherine encouraged the separation, declining visits, keeping her doors politely closed. When she appeared in public, it was as a composed widow at church or a reserved hostess at rare gatherings, her manners impeccable, her grief appropriately measured. No one glimpsed the machinery grinding behind the walls, or the quiet rearranging of lives beyond the oaks. And even if someone had sensed something amiss, what then? This was a land shaped by ownership of flesh. People were already counted, priced, and exchanged. What Katherine did was not a rupture from the norm, but a refinement of it. She took the logic of bondage and pursued it with chilling discipline. That was the most unsettling truth. Her design was not madness alone. It was the natural extreme of a system that reduced human beings to inventory. Within that framework, her conclusions were terrible, but consistent. Yet injustice breeds instability. Beneath the polished surface, tension thickened across the region. Arguments about expansion and power seeped into courthouse corridors and churchyards. Distant violence was discussed in hushed voices, as if naming it too loudly might summon it closer. Elections came and went without easing the strain. Katherine paid little heed. Her attention remained fixed on her estate, on the careful unfolding of her work. Politics were abstractions. Control was real. As years passed, the children she watched so closely began to change. Their limbs lengthened. Their voices shifted. The eldest carried themselves with an awareness that unsettled the servants who passed them in the halls. Katherine observed every alteration with satisfaction. They were not yet ready, but readiness approached. She began to consider future combinations, weighing bodies and temperaments with the patience of a gardener planning seasons ahead. It was then that she claimed a forgotten portion of the house and transformed it. Servants were told it would store family history, relics of a respectable lineage. In truth, it was something else entirely. A chamber sealed from daylight, lit by steady flames, where her vision was preserved and expanded. Shelves rose along the walls, bearing volumes bound in leather, each page dense with symbols and notes. Nearby, small containers rested in careful order, each holding a tangible fragment of the living archive she had created. Hair, labeled and dated, arranged by descent, proof of continuity, proof of possession. At the center stood a broad table covered in ink diagrams. These were not memories of the past, but maps of the future. Names were linked by lines and annotations predicting outcomes: strength, docility, sharpness of mind. The cold language of selection stripped away any illusion of kinship. It resembled the planning of animals bred for display or labor, except every name belonged to a person who breathed, who dreamed, who feared. She spent hours there, sometimes entire nights, imagining an estate filled with faces that mirrored her own, generations layered upon generations, all tethered to the land by blood and conditioning. In her thoughts, escape was impossible because belonging had been engineered. The plantation would sustain itself forever. No markets, no shortages, no rebellion. Famille, she called it, though the word bore no resemblance to its meaning. To ensure the vision held, she tightened her grip. Children were sorted by purpose, before they understood what purpose meant. Those closest to her remained near the house, their lives shaped by proximity and privilege. Others were kept apart, raised to work early, their distance reinforcing hierarchy. Yet she needed them too. They were necessary components, and so she learned to manipulate desire and fear with equal precision. Small rewards appeared for cooperation, extra rations, temporary leniency. For resistance, there were threats spoken softly, the promise of separation hovering like a blade. The pressure never ceased. It seeped into daily life, bending choices until they no longer felt like choices at all. One woman felt this weight more keenly than most. Violet had children she loved fiercely, children whose futures were suddenly not hers to protect. She understood what Katherine intended long before it was said aloud. She saw the measuring, the notes, the way certain names lingered longer on the mistress's tongue. Violet's nights filled with dread, her days with calculation. How much defiance could she afford? How much obedience would preserve what little safety remained? The plantation continued to function smoothly on the surface. Cotton moved. Accounts balanced. Katherine's reputation solidified. But beneath the order, anxiety spread like roots searching for water. Everyone sensed that something irreversible was being assembled. A structure so tightly bound it could only end in collapse or catastrophe. Beyond Thornhill's borders, the world shifted closer to conflict. Rumors hardened into certainty. The future pressed in from all sides. Katherine, however, remained focused inward, convinced that what she had built could withstand any storm. She believed blood and design would outlast law and war. She was wrong. Systems founded on cruelty rot from within. They crack under their own weight. The land remembers every injustice committed upon it, storing them like seeds. When the moment arrives, those seeds do not sprout gently. They break through stone, and so Thornhill stood, quiet and prosperous, its windows reflecting the sky, its fields stretching obediently toward the horizon. Inside, plans deepened. Outside, change gathered. Somewhere between them, fate waited, patient as the soil, ready to claim what had been planted and return it, transformed, to the surface. By the time the year turned and the air grew heavy with waiting, Katherine had reached another decision. Violet's eldest girl, Sarah, had grown tall enough in Katherine's eyes, her body judged ready by standards no child could ever consent to. The man selected for her was Elijah, a laborer whose years had carved lines into his face, old enough to have been her protector rather than her fate. Sarah trembled when she learned. She was still a child in her own mind, still clinging to scraps of girlhood, while Elijah carried the weight of decades. Violet fell to her knees and begged. She pleaded for time, for mercy, for anything that might delay the inevitable. Katherine listened without expression, and then offered a choice so cruel it barely needed to be spoken. There were other daughters, younger ones. A sale could solve many inconveniences, or Sarah could comply. Duty, Katherine called it. Obligation to the estate, obligation to her mother. Autumn swallowed what remained of Sarah's childhood. The pairing took place without ceremony, without tenderness, without escape. Months later, a baby girl was born amid blood and screams, and Sarah's body gave out beneath the weight it was never meant to carry. She was gone before she could learn what motherhood meant. Violet's grief hollowed her from the inside. She moved like a shadow afterward, hands working from habit rather than will, eyes emptied of light. Eventually even habit failed her. One morning she walked toward the river and did not return. The water closed over her, carrying away the last protest she could make. None of this reached beyond Thornhill's boundaries. Visitors, rare as they were, saw trimmed hedges and orderly rows, a household that functioned with unsettling calm. They never heard the whispers in the quarters, never saw the locked room where truth was catalogued and sealed away. Horror thrived in secrecy, and Katherine was meticulous in its concealment. Then the world beyond the plantation cracked open. A new president was chosen, and with him came fear and fury. States tore themselves away from the Union, declarations echoing like distant thunder. War announced itself with fire and cannon smoke, and though many believed it would pass quickly, it lingered like a sickness that refused to break. Young men marched off and vanished into battlefields far from home. Coffins returned, sometimes not even that. The war disrupted more than trade and comfort. It loosened Katherine's grip in ways she had never imagined. Her overseer left to fight and never came back. The replacement she found was old and tired, lacking the brutality that had once enforced silence. Discipline softened, and the enslaved population felt it. Information traveled along unseen paths, whispered from plantation to plantation. Rumors of victories, of proclamations promising freedom, of armies moving ever closer. Hope, dangerous and intoxicating, crept in. Katherine responded with control sharpened to desperation. She closed the gates tighter, forbade visits, rationed movement as carefully as food. She offered just enough to quiet unrest, but fear was her true currency, and she hastened her work. Plans once measured in years were forced forward. Children were pushed into roles before their minds could grasp what was being done to them. Jonathan reached the age Katherine had been waiting for, and she declared him ready. A girl named Rachel was chosen for him, quiet and young. Her future erased the moment Katherine spoke her name. The ceremony was staged in the main house, a hollow imitation of marriage, meant to cloak exploitation in ritual. Jonathan accepted it without resistance. He had been shaped too carefully, raised to trust the hand that bound him. He did not know the truth of his own blood. Rachel knew enough to be terrified, and terror stole her voice. In the quarters, eyes watched and remembered. The pattern was no longer subtle. The children raised apart, favored and isolated, were now being folded back into the machinery. This was the next turn of the wheel, and everyone felt it. Rage began to smolder, quiet and contained, waiting for a breath of air. As the war worsened, scarcity followed. Supplies thinned. Cloth wore to rags. Hunger sharpened tempers. Katherine tightened rations further, her own comforts protected while others endured less. Yet another danger crept through Thornhill, one she could not manage with locks or threats. Awareness. It began with Eleanor, always the one who noticed too much. Curiosity had been encouraged in her, just enough to serve Katherine's needs, never imagining it might turn inward. While helping with papers one afternoon, Eleanor found a journal left unsecured. The symbols within were familiar, but their meaning shifted as she read. Names, connections, notes written with chilling detachment. She recognized herself among them, recognized her siblings, recognized lines that should never have been drawn. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It seeped in, poisoning every memory. Lessons once framed as kindness twisted into tools of control. Affection revealed itself as ownership. The walls of the house felt closer, the air heavier. Eleanor said nothing at first, but knowledge does not stay silent for long. It moves. It infects, Thornhill stood on the brink, though Katherine could not see it. She was too focused on preserving what she believed she had perfected. She did not realize the children she had molded were beginning to see her clearly. She did not hear the quiet shift in the quarters, the way whispers grew sharper, more purposeful. Outside, armies clashed and nations bled. Inside, truth prepared to tear through the carefully maintained order. What had been planted was stirring, and it would not remain buried much longer. The symbols in the journal called to her like a whisper that refused to fade. Eleanor studied them in stolen moments, hiding the book beneath loose floorboards, returning to it night after night while the house slept. She worked patiently, obsessively, just as another boy had done years before, tracing patterns, testing substitutions, letting meaning surface one fragment at a time. Weeks slipped by unnoticed, and then, at last, the cipher broke open. What waited beneath was not knowledge but annihilation. The entry she deciphered did not speak of love or birth in any human sense. It spoke of planting, of selection, of timing and weather, of bodies reduced to raw material. Names appeared, stripped of tenderness, reduced to notes of utility. Her own name stared back at her from the page, surrounded by words that turned her stomach to ice. She read the passage again and again, hoping language would soften, hoping her eyes were betraying her. They were not. The man named there was Thomas. She knew him. Everyone did. He labored quietly in the fields, head bowed, gaze never lifted, as though the earth itself demanded his silence. He was not just a worker. He was her father, and the woman who had taught her to read, who had brushed her hair and praised her intelligence, was something far worse than a guardian. She was the architect of Eleanor's existence. The realization spread like poison. If this was true for her, it was true for the others. Jonathan, Abigail, Margaret, all of them were bound by blood to the same woman who claimed ownership over their futures. They were not rescued orphans. They were products, crafted, catalogued, prepared. The journal went further, colder still. It described what was yet to come. Lines and charts mapped lives not lived, children not yet born, bodies paired in advance like livestock. Eleanor found her own name again, tethered to a boy who did not even exist yet, her future reduced to a calculation. The room spun. Her body rebelled against the certainty of what Katherine intended. She was meant to become a vessel, a function, another link in a chain designed to stretch endlessly forward. That night, Eleanor confronted her. The words tore from her throat, sharp and unsteady, fueled by rage and terror. She spoke of the journal, of the truth, of the lie that had swallowed her childhood. Katherine listened without blinking. When Eleanor named her crimes, named her mother and father aloud, the air in the room turned brittle. Katherine's voice, when it came, was calm, commanding. Finiel, Eleanor was ordered to sit, and something in the tone stripped her of the will to resist. Katherine moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman arranging pieces on a board. When she spoke again, there was no pretense left. She admitted everything. The blood ties, the plan, the future she had designed for them all. She spoke of efficiency, of legacy, of necessity, as though these words could wash the filth from her intentions. Eleanor tried to refuse, but defiance collapsed under the weight of what Katherine offered in return. Sale, separation, violence beyond imagining, places where bodies were broken quickly and minds even faster. Katherine leaned close, her breath steady, her eyes unyielding. She painted the alternatives in vivid detail, making cooperation seem like mercy. Eleanor wept in silence. When she finally answered, her voice was barely there. Katherine believed she had won. But truth, once seen, does not stay contained. Eleanor waited. She watched. She measured the risk. And then, carefully, she began to speak. She told Jonathan first, repeating the words she had memorized, letting the truth spill out piece by piece. Jonathan listened, troubled but not transformed. His life had been shaped too thoroughly. His understanding narrowed to what Katherine allowed. He saw protection where Eleanor saw imprisonment. He mistook the cage for safety. Abigail did not. Nor did Margaret. They grasped the horror instantly, their young faces hardening with comprehension. They understood what they were being shaped into, and something shifted inside them. The younger children sensed change without knowing its source. The house itself seemed to breathe differently. Katherine noticed. She saw it in the way eyes lingered too long, in the silence that followed her instructions, in the subtle withdrawal of affection. Fear remained, but it was no longer pure. It was mixed now with calculation, with waiting. Katherine considered solutions late into the night. Punishment risked damage. Sale wasted years of effort. Control was slipping, and she knew it. What Katherine did not yet understand was that her greatest mistake was not cruelty. It was arrogance. She believed knowledge could be managed. That truth, once revealed, could be folded back into obedience. But what had been planted inside those children was no longer hers to command. And somewhere in the shadows of Thornhill, the future she had designed began to fracture. Quietly, relentlessly, preparing to turn against its maker. The night had swallowed the plantation before Grace tried to run. She was 17, swollen with life she had not chosen to bear, a girl clutching the last fragments of hope and freedom. She fled under the cover of darkness, aiming for the Savannah River, dreaming of South Carolina, dreaming of Union lines, dreaming of a life that did not belong to Katherine. But the land itself betrayed her. The dogs tracked her, their baying cutting through the night, until she was dragged back, exhausted, terrified, her hands bound, her dreams shattered. The next morning, Katherine summoned them all. The enslaved laborers, the field hands, the women who bore the weight of forced obedience, and her own children, raised apart from this world of suffering, lined up in the yard. Grace was brought before them, trembling, her wrists scarred already by the ropes. Katherine stood on the porch, still, unflinching, her voice calm and precise, speaking as if the world itself demanded her words. She declared Grace's crime, the betrayal of the estate, the betrayal of the order Katherine had built, and pronounced the punishment without hesitation. The whipping that followed was deliberate. The lashes fell across Grace's back, 20 in total, each one a punctuation of terror, administered by the aged overseer Kendrick, his face tight with reluctant compliance. The children watched, their eyes wide, the full horror of obedience pressed into them as Katherine intended. The message was clear: defiance had consequences. And yet, Katherine misjudged the effect. The fear she meant to instill instead revealed something deeper to them all. Her fear, her fragility, the very brutality she wielded betrayed her insecurity, and the enslaved people began to whisper among themselves, voices low and urgent, speaking of patience, of waiting, of survival until change came. Eleanor listened. She lingered near the quarters when Catherine's gaze turned elsewhere, learning the secrets of a world she had never known, a world Catherine had kept her from. She learned the truths Catherine hid: the men used, the women broken, the children born into plans they did not understand. Names, faces, stories stitched together a tapestry of cruelty, of exploitation, of lives meticulously catalogued for future utility. One October evening, Eleanor ventured beyond the quarters, into the dim woods where older women gathered in secrecy. The air was heavy with whispers, the smell of earth and sweat, and fear mingling with something darker: determination. Hope, a woman hardened by loss and endurance, looked at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and recognition. "Your mama," she said, "thinks she's creating something noble, something enduring. She's built a family. But all she's done is forge hatred, and she doesn't even understand it herself." Eleanor shivered. "What happens when the war ends?" she asked. "Depends on who wins," Hope replied. "Yankees win, we are free. Confederates win, and nothing changes, or it gets worse. But either way, your mama cannot continue what she's been doing. Too many have seen. Too many feel the anger she cannot comprehend. Something will break." Eleanor's voice dropped, a dangerous edge creeping in. "What if we make it break?" The women looked at her, startled. Hope leaned closer. "What are you saying, child? That we end this ourselves? That we refuse to wait for outside forces to deliver our freedom?" The idea hung in the air, sharp and electric, intoxicating in its audacity. Anna, younger, whispered the practical question: run, fight, or both? Hope's words were sober, her logic unflinching. "There are only Catherine and Kendrick. We are 40, they are 20. But the danger, the question of survival, pressed against Eleanor like a living thing. She was Catherine's daughter, raised apart, lighter-skinned, literate. Would they even accept her in the struggle she imagined? Before she could answer, a crackling of footsteps through the underbrush scattered the circle. Darkness swallowed them, each retreating with hearts hammering, minds racing. Eleanor ran toward the main house, adrenaline and terror entwining, wondering if discovery was imminent, if the carefully constructed order was about to collapse. But the next days brought no punishment, no immediate reprisal. Still, the seed had been sown. The notion that they did not have to wait for the war, that they could act themselves, began to grow, spreading through the quarters like wildfire in dry grass. Catherine felt it. The change, subtle and insidious, rippled through her carefully maintained order. She tightened surveillance, sent Kendrick patrolling at night, limited movement, rationed freedom even more, sensing that the quiet loyalty she depended on was shifting, mutating into something unmanageable. The tension at Thornhill estate thickened, a storm gathering beyond the horizon, crackling with potential energy, waiting for release. And then March of 1864 arrived, unremarked by the world, unheralded, and yet it carried with it the inevitability of rupture. The moment would not come from the distant armies, from Lincoln's proclamations or the distant thunder of war. No, it would come from within, from those who had learned the truth of their lives, who had been taught obedience and knew now the full scope of the lie. Eleanor's understanding, her courage, and the whispering network of the enslaved population had combined into a force Katherine could neither foresee nor contain. The estate held its breath, poised on the edge of collapse. Every shadow in the quarters, every flicker of candlelight in the main house, waiting for the storm Eleanor and the others were preparing. They had learned the power of patience, the strength of survival, and the weight of knowledge. They had seen Katherine's fear, and in that fear, discovered their own possibility. The lightning was coming, and when it struck, Thornhill would never be the same. The night air was heavy, tense, filled with the low hum of unseen insects and the distant cry of a lone owl. A unit of Confederate cavalry had swept through Burke County, storming plantations with the authority of war. Katherine had no choice but compliance. Corn, preserved meats, 2 of the estate's finest horses. Everything was surrendered without hesitation. The soldiers lingered only a single night, camping in the fields beyond the quarters, leaving at dawn as if they had never been. But their presence left a residue far more dangerous than the brief disruption of routine. They spoke freely, voices carrying across the fields, speaking of Sherman's march, of Union forces pressing in from all directions, of the inevitability of defeat. Some murmured hopelessly of the war's impending collapse, of the futility of continuing the fight. Every word filtered through the quarters like wind through dry grass, igniting hope, a dangerous, infectious hope. Freedom was no longer a distant rumor, it shimmered at the edges of possibility. The enslaved heard it, felt it, held it in their hearts, and it terrified Katherine. She knew, with cold certainty, that if the Confederacy fell, if the Yankees arrived, everything she had built, the breeding program, the careful order, the so-called family, would crumble. 16 years of meticulous control, every journal entry, every measurement, every carefully selected union, all would be erased. And she would not allow it. That night, March 17, 1864, Katherine called her children together. Jonathan, Eleanor, Abigail, Margaret, Samuel, William, Henry, Caroline, and the 3 youngest, still infants, huddled in the parlor, their collective breath catching in the candlelit shadows. 11 children, from 16 years to 6 months, gathered before her, and her calm voice carried a weight that froze them. "Things are going to change," she said, her eyes glittering with a cold, unshakable intensity. "The war may end badly. The Yankees may come. There may be attempts to take you from me. I cannot allow it." Eleanor felt a chill slither down her spine. "What are you planning?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "We are securing our future," Katherine replied, and she led them to the heritage room, the forbidden chamber in the east wing. The oil lamps flickered, casting grotesque shadows across shelves lined with journals, glass vials of hair samples, and sprawling family trees drawn with meticulous precision. "This," she said, her hand sweeping across the room, "is our legacy. No one will take it from us." From a locked cabinet, Katherine retrieved a small wooden box. Inside, glass bottles shimmered with clear liquid. Laudanum, she explained. A medicine that relieves pain in small doses, grants eternal peace in larger ones. Abigail's gasp fractured the heavy air. You want to poison us. I want to protect you. Katherine corrected sharply, desperation coiling in her voice. If the Yankees come, if you are freed, where would you go? You are neither white enough for their world, nor black enough to belong to anyone else. Outcasts. Alone. Do you understand? Eleanor's hands clenched. Anything is better than this, she said firmly. You are too young to understand, Katherine hissed, stepping toward the bottles, her eyes wild. I know what is best for this family. Jonathan moved then, stepping between her and the others. At 16, nearly as tall as his mother, there was a new steel in his eyes. No, he said quietly. Jonathan, do not be foolish. You've always understood the plan, Katherine said, voice taut with control. I understood what you told me, he replied, but Eleanor showed me the journals. I read every word about us, about Father Isaac, Father Thomas, all of them. I know what you did. I know what you are. You are our mother, but you are a monster. His voice broke on the word, raw and trembling. Katherine struck him sharply, the slap echoing through the small, lamp-lit room. How dare you! After everything I've given you, after all I've sacrificed! Eleanor stepped forward, her own trembling suppressed by anger. You used people. You destroyed them. You destroyed us. And then Katherine saw them, all of her children, united, eyes burning with fear and fury alike. Even the younger ones, too small to comprehend fully, felt the fracture in her authority and stood silently with their older siblings. She had lost them. A final, desperate plan seized her. If she could not control them, if they would not bend, she would at least preserve the evidence of her creation, clutching the journals, the charts, the vials of hair like sacred trophies. She whispered to herself, You think you can escape me? These records will survive. They will prove what I built. They will prove I was right. She surged past them, fleeing through the house, across the yard, toward the quarters, carrying every trace of her crimes with manic speed. Jonathan and Eleanor pursued, but Katherine's desperation lent her an almost inhuman swiftness. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The shadows lengthened, and the estate seemed to hold its breath. What happened next depended entirely on who told the story. Some said the children cornered her before she could disappear. Others whispered that she vanished into the night, clutching her legacy to her chest, a phantom fleeing the truth of her own making. But one thing was certain, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The careful, calculated world Katherine had constructed for 16 years, the system of control and fear was breaking. Outside, the war raged on, armies clashing, nations bleeding. Inside Thornhill Estate, the true revolution had begun. Fear, knowledge, and courage intertwined in the hearts of the children Katherine had tried to mold. They had seen their mother's fear. They had seen the cracks in her perfect order. And in that moment, they discovered something more potent than terror. They discovered possibility. The storm was coming, silent yet inevitable, and when it struck, Thornhill would never be the same. The shadows that had lingered for generations were stirring, and the legacy of Katherine Thornhill, meticulously crafted, would confront the very people she had tried to command. The estate waited, trembling, as the first spark of revolt flickered into life, a quiet, relentless blaze that would not be contained. The night that changed everything at Thornhill Estate was a blur of smoke, shouting, and shadows, seen through the fractured memories of those who survived. Everyone remembered it differently, shaped by fear, trauma, and the weight of 16 years of cruelty. What no one disputed was the moment Katherine appeared in the quarters, clutching the journals and vials that contained the dark proof of her work. The children, the adults, the enslaved, they all saw her then, running toward them in the dark, her eyes wide and frantic, the very embodiment of terror. She had tormented them for years, and now, in that instant, she seemed small, mortal, vulnerable, carrying the evidence of everything she had done. And somewhere in that tense, trembling crowd, someone, maybe Hope, maybe one of the men, perhaps several at once, made a decision. This was the night it ended. Katherine Thornhill vanished into the darkness. The journals lay scattered in the mud, torn and unreadable. Glass vials containing strands of hair were shattered, their contents lost to the soil. The charts, meticulously drawn over years, had been burned, and Katherine herself was gone, swallowed by shadows, leaving behind only the chaos of her legacy undone. Jonathan and Ella arrived at the quarters minutes later, hearts hammering, to find a scene of disorder. People ran in every direction, smoke curling from a hastily lit fire, the acrid scent filling the air. But Katherine, where was she? Jonathan demanded, voice sharp with panic. Hope met him with a look he could not read, her eyes cool, unreadable. Gone. That's all you need to know. She's gone. And she ain't coming back. What did you do to her? Jonathan pressed. What she had coming, Hope said simply, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. Now you got a choice, boy. You can raise hell about your mama, or you can understand that justice was served tonight and let it rest. Ella, pale and wide-eyed, nodded slowly. Let it rest, she whispered. By morning, Katherine Thornhill was officially missing. Old Mr. Kendrick combed the estate for any sign of her, finding nothing. The sheriff from Westboro investigated, ultimately concluding that she had fled, a reasonable assumption, given the chaos of war and the advance of Union forces. The official record was Tercy Katherine Thornhill disappeared on the night of March 17, 1864, and was never seen again. But the truth lingered quietly in every shadow of Thornhill Estate. Katherine had been killed. Her body had been disposed of somewhere across the 700 acres she had ruled with tyranny. Her children, the very ones she had tried to control, mold, and exploit, had allowed it. They spoke nothing, punished no one, but all knew Katherine had earned her fate. The estate was theirs now, but not through inheritance or law. Through survival, patience, and the grim justice of those she had oppressed, the war marched on. Sherman's army cut a path through Georgia in late 1864, skirting Burke County, never touching Thornhill directly. The Confederacy crumbled in April of 1865, leaving freedom enslaved. For the formerly enslaved, that freedom was at once exhilarating and disorienting. Jonathan, Katherine's eldest, technically held legal claim to the property, but his status was ambiguous. Talbot, the lawyer in Westboro, attempted to untangle the mess of law, inheritance, and human ownership, but gave up. Thornhill estate sank into legal limbo, a relic of a system that no longer existed. Many who had endured Katherine's reign fled immediately, scattering across Georgia and beyond. They sought family, reclaimed lives stolen by the plantation system, or simply fled the land where they had been bound. Some lingered, at least for a time. Hope stayed, guiding those with nowhere else to go. Thomas, Eleanor's biological father, remained quietly, finally acknowledging his daughter after 16 years. One conversation about Katherine passed between them, sharp and wordless, and then the past was buried. The wound was too deep, too entwined with horrors too complicated to name. Eleanor remained at Thornhill until 1867, learning the strange, delicate rhythms of freedom while carrying the invisible scars of childhood. She moved to Savannah, took up work as a seamstress, and married a carpenter named William Foster. She never bore children. She never spoke publicly of Thornhill, of Katherine, of the years of manipulation, terror, and exploitation that had shaped her and her siblings. When she died in 1903, her obituary contained no trace of the plantation, no hint of the shadows that had defined her earliest life. The story of Thornhill and Katherine's monstrous legacy lived only in the quiet memories of those who had survived, whispered among themselves, but never spoken aloud. The estate itself remained a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within its brick walls and oak-shaded quarters. The journals, the charts, the carefully measured evidence of Katherine's systematic cruelty had been destroyed. But the effects lingered, etched into the minds and bodies of the children she had tried to control, a testament to the unimaginable darkness of a mind driven by obsession, fear, and a perverse sense of legacy. And in the end, Thornhill Estate had a new order. The storm had passed, leaving survivors not as property, not as extensions of someone else's will, but as people finally able to breathe, to move, to choose. Freedom, once a whisper through the smoke-filled night, had become reality. The power Katherine had believed unassailable had crumbled, her meticulous world shattered by those she had underestimated. The estate waited quietly in the aftermath, the ghosts of its past lingering in every shadow, every empty room, every scorched patch of earth. Thornhill would never forget what had happened, and those who had lived through it carried a secret that would never leave them. Katherine Thornhill had vanished, her name erased from the official record, but the echoes of her crimes and the reckoning of her children would resonate through the history of the land forever. The darkness had been broken, not by law, not by armies, but by those who had survived, who had known fear and endured it, who had taken fate into their own hands. And in that quiet reckoning, Thornhill Estate had finally become free. Jonathan lingered on the fractured land, clinging to the memory of Thornhill as if its soil, cracked and exhausted, could somehow hold the ghosts of his past at bay. He labored with a small group of freed men who remained behind, men who had nowhere else to go, tethered to the ruins of a plantation that still reeked of memory and blood. But the cotton market offered little mercy, and the earth itself seemed spent, unwilling to yield more than whispers of its former bounty. Rumors of Thornhill's dark history had begun to ripple through the black community of Burke County, a tale half hidden, half remembered, and all-consuming. By 1869, Jonathan abandoned the estate, drifting west like a shadow seeking refuge. He settled in Texas under a false name, leaving behind everything that had been both home and prison. When he died in 1891, his few possessions were grimly ordinary, except for a small notebook scrawled in minuscule, desperate letters. "I did not choose this. I did not choose this. I did not choose this." Thornhill estate itself surrendered to ruin with alarming speed. The main house, grand and imposing in memory, was gutted in a suspicious fire in 1871, its walls blackened and crumbling. The outbuildings, once the framework of human suffering and meticulous cruelty, collapsed under neglect and weather. By 1878, unpaid taxes claimed the land, sold off to a timber company that leveled the old-growth trees, carving the estate into parcels, erasing the scars of Katherine's obsessive dominion. Yet the past has a way of clawing its way back. In 1871, a well driller working nearby inadvertently breached a hidden shaft beneath the former Thornhill grounds. 30 feet below the surface, in the cool, dry silence, lay a skeleton, nearly intact, a grim preservation of history. The bones belonged to a woman, likely in her 30s or 40s. Faded remnants of cloth clung to her frame, echoes of a dress from the 1860s. A corroded metal locket lay nearby, cradling 2 tiny portraits, one of a man, one of a child. The coroner concluded blunt force trauma to the skull had ended her life, though the official record reduced her to a mere hawk-known female discovered on former Thornhill property, 1871. But whispers carried more truth than any legal report. The black community of Burke County knew the story in its fullness, passed through kitchens, churches, and quiet corners with coded words meant to shield memory from outsiders. They knew Katherine Thornhill had been killed that night in March 1864, that the people she had enslaved had finally reclaimed their power, exacting justice in their own terrible way. The body had been hidden in a deep shaft, a monument to a reckoning both personal and collective. Justice, unrecorded, uncompromised, had been done. Years passed, fragments of the story surfaced intermittently, fragile shards of memory that refused to be forgotten. In 1889, a dying man in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had participated in the killing of his former mistress in Georgia during the war. Names were absent, details withheld, but the confession left a tremor, a confirmation of what many already believed. In 1902, a woman in Savannah, granddaughter of Hope, wrote briefly in a memoir of the night, "The devil mistress vanished," noting the absence of mourning, the eerie satisfaction that seemed to linger in the community. The most damning evidence arrived decades later, in 1923, when a historian delving into Burke County's Civil War history unearthed letters in the courthouse basement. Among them was a report from Union Captain Samuel Reynolds, describing the horrors discovered at Thornhill Estate. He wrote of systematic breeding experiments carried out by the late mistress upon enslaved people, including her own children. He noted witnesses had verified the grotesque plans, a self-perpetuating workforce constructed through manipulation and violence across generations. Katherine Thornhill's disappearance in March 1864 was referenced in the documents, and though the details of her fate were never explicit, the implication was unmistakable. Reynolds wrote that justice had been enacted, and he had chosen not to pursue the matter further, acknowledging the propriety of what had occurred. The letter was filed, forgotten, then rediscovered decades later in 1954 by a graduate student researching Reconstruction in Georgia. She sought the living memory of Thornhill, interviewing elderly residents whose recollections wavered between denial and revelation. Most claimed ignorance, protective or genuine, but one 93-year-old woman, the great-granddaughter of an enslaved person who had survived that fateful night, whispered some things happened that needed to happen. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of generations, the unspoken justice delivered in the absence of law, the reclamation of power from someone who had sought to own life itself. Time wore on, yet the shadow of Thornhill Estate remained. The land changed hands, the trees fell, and the ruins decayed, but the memory endured in whispers and warnings, in the quiet courage of those who had survived, and in the silence of those who refused to speak. Thornhill had been freed, but only because those who had lived through fear, cruelty, and captivity had seized their own freedom, had acted when the law could not, had delivered the reckoning that history might never fully record. The estate, scarred and hollowed, stood as both relic and reminder. Its ghosts lingered, not as tormentors, but as witnesses to survival, resilience, and the hidden justice of a people denied voice for too long, and the story of Katherine Thornhill, her obsession, her tyranny, and her final, inevitable downfall, became legend, half hidden in plain sight, a tale passed down in the spaces between words, whispered in kitchens, carried in memory, never fully written, never fully forgotten, yet impossible to deny. The darkness of Thornhill had been broken, not by armies, not by law, but by those who had known fear, endured it, and acted. In that quiet, unrecorded reckoning, the estate was finally free, and in the spaces where her shadow once fell, the descendants, the survivors, and the memory of the oppressed carried forward a story that refused to die, a story that waited, patient as the soil, for the next listener, the next witness, the next telling. Some things happened that needed happening, and that is where explanation ends. The final secret of Thornhill Estate lingers in silence, a shadow locked away in memory. When federal troops finally arrived, they found 23 children imprisoned in the basement, their eyes wide with confusion and fear, their small bodies pressed together as if they could hold each other against the horror of 16 years. Captain Reynolds mentioned them in his official report, a footnote to history, and fragments appear in letters written by soldiers who could not erase the sight from their minds. The children were liberated, placed with families of freed men across Burke County and the surrounding lands, yet what became of them afterward is a story lost to the ages. Some surely survived, their lives quietly weaving into the fabric of communities that would never know the origin of their endurance. Some of them had children, and through those lines, the blood of Katherine Thornhill's creations continues. Pale green eyes, reddish hair, sharp, striking features, echoes of a system designed to engineer life itself. They do not know. They cannot know. that their ancestors were subjected to a meticulously calculated program of control and cruelty, that their very existence began in exploitation. They will never know that a woman who saw herself as a visionary used human flesh and spirit as instruments in her pursuit of permanence, that the body of their great-great-grandmother rests in an unmarked grave somewhere in Burke County, placed there by the hands of those who had suffered under her, who had survived her tyranny and chosen silence over vengeance in freedom. The landscape of Thornhill Estate today is quiet, fields stretching out, forests reclaiming what was once methodically owned. No historical marker acknowledges the horrors buried there. No textbooks mention the plantation in detail. Only the faint outlines of the house's foundation remain, hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and untamed growth. The well that once concealed Katherine's corpse has collapsed, filled with earth and memory. Yet, despite the silence, the story endures. It survives in the whispered recollections of Burke County's black community, in tales shared in kitchens and at church pews, carried forward in cautious genealogy research, hinted at in studies of slavery, eugenics, and the darkest impulses of human power. The truth of Thornhill is stubborn. It refuses to be fully buried, because it speaks of something more than brutality. It speaks of rationalized cruelty, of the cold, systematic measures humans will take when absolute authority bends morality to convenience. Katherine Thornhill believed she was crafting a legacy, that she was creating a new order for her family, a model of control disguised as foresight. In reality, she perpetuated one of humanity's most profound evils, weaving domination into flesh and blood. Yet the people she enslaved ultimately became architects of her erasure. Her name vanished from history almost as completely as she sought to erase the identities of those she oppressed. And in that erasure, a quiet justice lingered. One wonders if the earth itself remembers her, if the trees that now reclaim Thornhill Estate whisper the secrets of what once transpired there. Perhaps there are truths still buried under the soil, in roots and shadows, too stubborn to surface, carrying the echoes of horror, fear, and resistance for anyone willing to listen. The question remains, do we ever truly uncover such stories, or are we only allowed fragments? Fragments that hint at horrors we cannot fully confront. The survivors held some knowledge in their hearts, choosing which pieces to carry forward, which to lock away forever. Perhaps it is theirs to decide, the right to contain the truth, to let it be their secret, their victory, their shield. And yet, in remembering, in speaking, in sharing the quiet histories of those who endured, we honor them. Their survival matters. Their resistance matters. Even as time erases the physical traces of Thornhill, the human witness endures. For those descendants who unknowingly bear the legacy of Thornhill, the story is a shadow upon their existence, a whisper carried in DNA, and the faint turn of a family tale. They are proof that life persists, that survival is possible even when the system is designed to extinguish it. Thornhill Estate, with all its ghosts and scars, remains a monument not to Katherine's obsession, but to the resilience of those she tried to control. Every whispered memory, every fragment of oral history, every cautious confession across generations forms a network of remembrance that Katherine could never suppress. The land lies quiet now, but listen closely, and you might hear it, the low hum of memory, the rustle of leaves carrying echoes of the enslaved who survived, who whispered, who acted when no law could protect them. They rose from the darkness, took their fate into their own hands, and reclaimed power in ways that historians rarely record. Thornhill's shadow may fall over the fields, but the light of survival, of hidden justice, endures brighter than any ruin. In the end, the estate is free. Not by legislation, not by armies, but by those who endured, who survived, who understood fear and wielded it with patience and purpose. The story persists, patient as the soil itself, waiting for the next witness, the next listener, the next voice to carry forward the tale of resistance, survival, and the reckoning that finally brought Thornhill to its quiet, haunted end. Some things happened that needed to happen. And that, ultimately, is all that needs to be said.